What's up, football fans? Lindsay, Rhodes, and Sam Bruchhaus with you on the SumerSports show. Heading into week 16. We are coming down the final stretch. I feel like week 15, Sam, was really, really big in terms of just clarifying a few things and making it more clear than it ever has been about who are the teams and from top to bottom, who's the strongest, like what we're actually looking at as we come down the stretch and head into the playoffs.
Certainly, some takes went down of mine.
Takes.
The Jets are still confusing me, but you know what? I listened to Dan
How is that where
Campbell's
you start? After that week, you're like, the Jets are what I need to talk about.
because it was fascinating, but nonetheless, I listened to Dan Campbell's radio hit this morning. I'm ready to come back. I'm ready to run through walls, eat nails. Inspired to watch the Lions defense give up 92 points next week. There's all kinds of good stuff happening in the NFL, Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Bills Lions was huge. I think Eagles Steelers was also big. It's hard to really know what you're looking at with the Steelers. It's become pretty clear that George Pickens is massively important to that offense.
Right.
I mean, he's off the field and it all kind of falls apart. Like just absolutely nothing. And clearly the Eagles are a very good defense and have proven that in the last few weeks. But that was a great game for the Eagles in terms of just re-emphasizing like that they're a team that we need to keep our eye on. The Steelers, I think, it did the opposite for me. I have an expectation this week as the Steelers play the Ravens on Saturday for the division lead, a game that is massively important for the Steelers. That, I mean, I know injuries are injuries, but I kind of think that this is the game that George Pickens has to be on the field for regardless.
Certainly. And the Ravens' one major weakness all year has been their passing defense. And we've started to see Nate Wiggins start to come along. We're still seeing Stevens, the other cornerback, alongside Wiggins and Humphrey, struggle from time to time, particularly at the close. Like he's pretty good at limiting separation, but just at the catch point, he hasn't been super effective. And given that George Pickens is one of the most effective wide receivers at making plays at the catch point, and their whole offense is based around Russell Wilson getting the ball deep down the field in those situations and letting his guys make plays, that seems like the one way that they can really attack here, especially given I think Joey Porter had a pretty good game, but when it comes down to it, the corner struggled to tackle, and against a team where Derrick Henry is going to be running on outside zones and Lamar Jackson is going to be running in read options, and they're going to have Todd Monken scheme up all kinds of interesting gap schemes, sweeps, and getting the wide receivers involved. I think that's really the matchup to watch in that game is, can the corners that have been ascending slowly but still a below average unit for the Ravens, can they stand up should George Pickens come back? And if George Pickens doesn't end up being healthy, can the Steelers do anything really?
Yeah, I mean, I saw, again, against the Eagles, but difference between the Eagles and the Ravens in terms of what the Steelers would offensively be bringing to the table. Like the Ravens against the run, I don't know if I see a path forward for the Steelers in that game.
Right.
In terms of what Najee and Jaylen Warren were able to do last week without that threat of a downfield passing game. I just think that George Pickens becomes like among the most needed, valuable assets this week in terms of, tilting a matchup one way or the other. So that'll be a game that we're watching on Saturday. The Lions are another team that obviously every week you're keeping an eye on them. They've got the Bears this week, which feels like the exact matchup that they need, frankly.
Certainly.
Kind of a get right game in a whole bunch of different ways. The Lions now having lost David Montgomery, in addition to all of the defensive players that they just continue to lose. I mean, there's somebody put out a social media post listing all of the players that they've lost to injured reserve. It's like an entire starting lineup's worth of people. And it's been just incredible the way they've been able to keep it together defensively. And obviously last week against the Bills didn't go their way, but the fact that they were still in it and it's still the Bills makes me feel like I don't know what to make of the Lions moving forward. Like, is the rate of attrition getting to them? Is it just like, now do I need to be like, am I worried about them in the playoffs? Have they just suffered too many injuries at this point? Or can they keep it together the way they have in weeks past? And is it a good sign that they were still in that game? And we were talking about some of the game management stuff with Dan Campbell and whether or not he did the onside kick too early. And if he didn't, then, does the game turn out differently? What was your takeaway about the Lions in that one?
As sad as it is for me to say this, as someone
I don't like
who
this. I don't like this.
Weeks before the season started, bet Sean Syed a tasting menu in the city of New York that the Lions were going to win 14 games. Like, I think that's still in the realm of possibility, but I just don't know how you can plan to compete in the playoffs without like slim margins of victory when you're basically playing a practice squad defense. And ability is the best availability is the best ability. And it's sad. Like, it's just sad what's happened. That's the way the game has broken. They're really going to have to rely, one, very subjective, on the culture, which Dan Campbell's pushing heavy in his media hits right now. And two, on the fact that their offense can light it up and score on anyone at any time. The funniest part of the Lions-Bills game was when it looked like Bates got the onside kick. I was like, oh, they're just going to score and win this game. We've seen it so many times this year, them just be able to pull it out. I think it was Taron Johnson that recovered it. If Taron Johnson wouldn't have recovered that, I was just like fully bought back in that they were going to hit a Hail Mary just because it's been that kind of year. Yep. And I think from someone who's been in the locker room a lot, like trying to remain cohesive seems like they got the checkbox, but it looks like the path to the Super Bowl at this point is going to have to be the Matt Ryan Falcons Super Bowl run, where we're going to have to outscore any and everyone. Luckily, they're in the correct conference to do that, given some of the quarterback question marks, even though a lot of people have seemed very good. And given the fact that you're not going to have to go against, Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen again, or Patrick Mahomes, I think that's kind of the outlay of them. Unfortunately now, just because they have 20 something guys out on defense, I think they're underneath the Eagles in terms of someone who I realistically think can pull out any playoff game.
Yeah, it's and the number is wild that you say of players that they've lost, but it's not even just the number, because people have hit me with like, well, the Packers did it and they had this many people that were out, and it's the people. It's not the number. It's the actual like names attached to those numbers. Like, we're just pulling important players to that defense off like one by one on a week by week basis. You've got Hutchinson saying that he'll be back if they, make it to the Super Bowl. So please hang on and just get there, and then I'll be back and can help you out. And maybe he'll be like Patrick Mahomes with the high ankle sprain, which, by the way, I think that we are way overreacting to. And I know that, logic dictates that we should react to it in the exact manner in which people are reacting to it. But historically, Patrick Mahomes with a high ankle sprain is weirdly better than the Patrick Mahomes with two working legs. So I won't be the one who's particularly worried about the Chiefs at this point in time. But that also goes with the fact that like they are a counterintuitive team in all the ways. So
certainly.
Detroit's defense, weeks 1 through 9, they were 5th in EPA per play against and 15th in success rate against, which I think that this is interesting. It's kind of going in an interesting direction when I tell you since week 10. So now week 10 to week 15, they're 12th in EPA per play against, but they're 3rd in success rate against.
It's tough. I mean, I think the thing to take away is there just simply can't be a pass rush at this point. I was going through everyone they've lost. They've lost Aiden Hutchinson, who was in the talk of, defensive player of the year. They lost Aleem McNeil, who got Pro Bowl votes when we were all voting for the Pro Bowler. They lost Marcus Davenport, who was their other defensive end. They're losing linebackers who could potentially blitz. At this point, you're really just like trying to hinge on anything. And I think people are able to get big plays because we saw it from Josh Allen. He was able to hang back there, roll out, and then all of a sudden throw a 60, 70-yard bomb. And I think that was really kind of showing or telling of what people can expect from a Detroit Lions defense that can try to buckle down as much as they can and stop the run game and stop from being bled dry. But at the end of the day, they just don't have the bodies to stop the big plays unless Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph are doing something fantastic.
Why do you think their success rate is still so high or low, I guess, since it's a defensive stat here?
I'm trying to think in particular the last 2 games, what has happened to them. And I'm thinking about the James Cook big run. I'm thinking about the Josh Allen big throw. I'm thinking about Jordan Love really trying to push it down the field. I'm thinking about some big runs from Josh Jacobs. And it seems like people are more willing to take shots against them because of the errors. When I'm thinking of the great success rate teams, typically that's going to be involving, interior runs, short precision passing.
Yeah.
And when you know that you can headhunt against a team and they've given up something like 80 plus points in the past 2 games, and you look back at some of the other weeks, some of those were blowouts, like before they really lost everyone.
Yeah.
And so maybe that plays into a little bit where, you're just letting them run at that point in those first, 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember the exact games that are in this subset, but the last 2, it's definitely been the big plays just absolutely throttling them. And I think that's a result of teams really attacking. In particular, like you're playing Joe Brady and you're playing Matt LaFleur. These are 2 of the better play callers in the league. They're going to ID the weakness, and they're going to attack it.
Yeah, this is a team that's been just crushing fools all year long. Plus 177, still the leaders in the NFL in terms of margin of victory. But the last 3 games have been tight, all 1-score games, a 6-point loss to the Bills, and then a 3-point win against the Packers the week before, and then a 3-point win against the Bears. I almost want to go back and look at that Bears game again because the Bears have been so bad since then, but I don't necessarily think that we overvalued like what the Bears were doing at that time. I don't necessarily think we can go back and say like, oh, maybe the Lions defense was just actually worse than we thought at that moment. Because I think that the Bears were, if you just watch the game, they looked so much better that week than they have in the last 2 weeks since the interim OC became the interim head coach. Like, to me, I'm willing to write off everything I've seen from the Packers in the last 2 weeks to just that, like too much too soon. And it's a mess. But the Lions beat the Packers 1 week ago. And again, we keep talking about like now we just are slowly chipping away, at the roster, but not for nothing, a 3-point win over the Packers, who looked incredible against the Seahawks, and are a team that I think they're an interesting team for the postseason. I think that that's a quality win for the Lions. So I just don't want to get too ahead of ourselves in terms of like, oh my God, they're so banged up. They lost to the Bills. Well, the Bills are second in margin of victory on the season at plus 135. So a lot of people would point to them as the best team maybe in the AFC, though not without some maybe weaknesses that I know you want to talk about. But let's go to the Packers first. Since I brought them up, because I think that they're a very interesting team. And I know that you and Sean have talked about the way that they're running the ball, the scheme that they are doing that in, and the ways in which they're kind of being. One of the things that jumped out to me is Jordan Love. So I also operate in the fantasy space. Jordan Love has not had a particularly good fantasy season. Like, he's not a guy that you're looking to play in fantasy. He's not putting up big numbers, but weeks. And I don't know if it's still true for week 15 through week 15, but I do know for weeks 10 through 14, Jordan Love #1 in EPA / CPOE composite score in the NFL, which I just don't. I think that that's one that if you're just like looking at the rankings, you're like, what? Jordan? Huh? Because it doesn't feel like the offense has been going through him. It's certainly been going through Josh Jacobs. And so his numbers have been down. He's been very efficient with the way that he's running that offense now that he's healthier. Clearly was not as healthy in the first half of the season. And now that he is healthier, he's having a lot more success because they're not even leaning on that in order to win games. And I'm not even talking about the defense yet. I think Green Bay is starting to feel like a very interesting team as we head into the postseason too.
I think they're a major threat, and it's kind of become the expectation particularly looking at his performance last year down the stretch, for them to just start locking it in as it starts getting colder for whatever reason. I guess much like Josh Allen, his talent, his arm strength, and his ability to create plays, I guess, can kind of shine in those environments. And I'm looking back at some of the teams that they got dubs against. Like, these aren't terrible teams. The 49ers, the Dolphins, they very well could have beat the Lions. It came down to the stretch, and then they murder the Seahawks.
Yeah.
So it's a phenomenon, really, that he just gets better as the season goes on. And maybe it's a comfort thing. Maybe it's a Matt LaFleur thing. An interesting stat that I found for them all year is that they lead the league in or they lead the league in rush rate over expected. And so they're running the ball substantially more than, in an average team would. The closest team to that is the Philadelphia Eagles. And so I'm wondering if there isn't a certain, through line between Jalen Hurts playing pretty well last week and Jordan Love being able to do this, given that they're doing everything they can to set up the pass, really, to a certain degree. What I'm really excited about the Packers is the defense. I think Edgerrin Cooper coming back is such a big difference maker for that team, which is strange to say for, the linebacking position, which has been kind of devalued in certain years. But I loved him coming out of Texas A&M, and he was all over the field in a way that the Roquan Smiths of the world and the Frank Warners of the world really are. And if they can get that level of impact player on a defense who has been, I don't want to call them shaky because they've been good, but they've typically, as we kind of talked about with the Lions, been more of that big play, let's call us havoc team. And if they can just have someone roaming the middle of the field now who is just going to shut down things and not allow, short, medium level plays to happen, that could be a real game changer for them. And he could be an X factor going into the playoffs.
Yeah, the Packers defense 7th since week 10 in EPA per play against. You know who's right ahead of them?
I don't know.
It's, you would never, ever, ever guess. And people listening, this is one that popped to me this week as I was looking through some rankings. I was like, I need to dig into this. And it is the Tampa Bay defense, which has been just in an aside, like, oh, the Tampa Bay defense is terrible. Play all your fantasy assets. Oh, you've got Tampa Bay this week. Like, the offense is great, and we all know all of the different ways in which that's true. The defense was pretty bad for the majority of the season. Weeks 1 through 9, they were 27th in EPA per play. They were 29th in success rate. Since week 10, they are 6th in EPA per play against. They are 4th in rush EPA per play against. They're still 19th in success rate, though. And so you go back and you look at the schedule of teams that they've played in that time frame, and they've not played particularly good teams. Let's see, I want to say it's not necessarily in order, the Raiders, the Chargers, the Panthers, the Giants, the Niners, who did have CMC in that game, and they were pretty good against CMC, at least on the ground, again, leading to the rush EPA. I think he had like 40 rushing yards or something in that game, so they kept him in check. But I guess my question here is Tampa Bay getting better on the defensive side of the ball, or are they benefiting from some matchups where they can look like they're getting better?
I'm going to go on the more passive side and say I think they're benefiting from these matchups. When I dove deep into this question, because I thought it was fascinating as you brought it up, I wanted to see if these players in our all-in-one metrics, when we're looking at all of their traits and what they're doing on the field and how they're affecting other players, were good. And obviously, Vita Vea and Yaya Diaby, the two kind of cornerstones of that defense, have been playing very well. We've seen Levante David kind of peak back into an above-average run defender as well. But most of these other guys are kind of around average or slightly below average. And so I'm inclined to be a little bit more conservative in saying that I expect them to do well. And I think this week upcoming is going to be really interesting for them going and playing the Cowboys, because the Cowboys have started to lean in to Rico Dowdle as a feature back behind Cooper Rush. And most interestingly, their interior three linemen, their center and both guards, including and notably Tyler Smith, are now starting to peak up in that 70th to 80th percentile run blocker range in those same all-in-one metrics. And so given that the probably understanding would be that this is just an above average run offense from the Cowboys, if they're able to stop them, I think we can have a little bit more belief in this Tampa run defense. But I think right now they are taking advantage of having a player like Vita Vea that no one can really block anytime, much less, a normal time. And then also playing some teams, even like the Chargers, who have, decent run blockers who are just either undermanned or have been pretty bad all year on the run defense side.
All right,
The run offense side.
I've got more to say about this, but first, I can't let another second go without acknowledging the Hitchcockian thing that is happening on your screen. Like you have like blinds in front of you, and so we have lines on your face, and it looks very like film noir or something like that. It's like we're going for something here that is intriguing.
Unplanned. The sun bounces off of 3 buildings that are right in front of my window, and so that's kind of what's going on right now.
All right, I'm going to try to focus without focusing on the lines on your face. Tampa Bay, going back to Dowdle and this week, and if that's the way that the Cowboys try to attack him, at least Carolina, which is a team that has gotten better but is not a particularly good team, like they held Chuba intact, and that's not necessarily been something that teams have consistently been able to do. So I mentioned CMC and the fact that they had some success against him. I don't know. That'll be an interesting matchup, and I'm just sort of putting it on my radar of things that might not go the way that you're totally expecting it to go. Like I'm like preparing to be surprised potentially. Although, would anything surprise me about the Cowboys being held in check? Probably not.
That's a good point.
So yeah, there is that. There is something somewhat surprising that you wanted to talk about today. That was about the Buffalo Bills and coming off of that big win. And I think everybody in Bills Mafia is feeling pretty good about themselves. And you are here to just stomp all over that to a degree.
Yeah. If you would ask me 3 weeks ago who I really believed in, it would have been the Lions, the Bills, and the Chiefs, just because the Chiefs never lose for whatever reason.
Lions, Bills, Chiefs. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I dropped the Lions and the Bills out after this game. I dropped them into the second tier because you cannot go 2 straight games giving up like 90 plus points and compete when you have to play Lamar. You have to go through Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. And now all of a sudden it's looking like we're having news that there's a quarterback change for the Browns. It's looking like there's a far away chance that Joe Burrow might get in. If you have to play any subset of those 2 guys, much less just one, and you can't stop them, I don't know how you can win a game. And so it was so funny because as the game kept going on, I was like, oh, the Bills are really looking good. Bills are really looking good. And I was like, okay, Jared Goff is doing whatever he wants. Jared Goff is delivering balls over the middle every single play. Oh my God, they're going to score every single play. And it was like a nightmare. It was like a slow horror thriller or something like that. And I just don't know how a team, given they were missing both safeties, but all of their big time players were there. Greg Russo was there and had, frankly, a pretty good game, several pressures. I think he got a sack as well. Ed Oliver was there. Matt Milano's back. Taron Johnson was there. And they just could do nothing to stop the Lions. And the week before, they could not do anything to stop the Rams.
Yeah.
And I think this is a trend. And I don't think when we're this late in the season, particularly when you're an ascendant team like the Bills, you got to take stock in that. And I just don't know how they're going to stop. We saw it earlier in the season. They literally could not stop the Ravens. The Ravens stomped all over them.
Yeah,
and if that's going to be the matchups that they're going to have to go up against, I just don't know how it's going to be successful in the playoffs.
I think that's a good point. But also, I think more often than not, good offense does beat good defense. And I think that we're just citing examples of that, whether or not they fall into the good defense category or not. Like I am not willing to overreact to a very good offense having success against a defense one way or the other. clearly, as you mentioned, two of their worst games in EPA per play allowed were the last 2 weeks against the Lions and Rams. The other bad game in that department, tied for their worst game, was week 4 against the Ravens. Those are all 3 very, very good offenses. The Rams kind of like, are a roller coaster in that department, but they have the ability to be one of the best offenses in the league on a week-to-week basis. So I'm willing to look at that and then also ask this follow-up question. Are there examples this year that you could point to of a good defense having a good game against a good offense, where you're like, look at how they did rise to that occasion, and man, they really like swallowed that offense up in a way that has to do with them and not the offense having an off day?
I mean, I think the Eagles have kind of done this all year. They did it against the Commanders. They shut Jaden Daniels down in a way that we hadn't seen him be shut down prior to that. We've seen them shut down the Ravens. We've seen them shut down the Rams. And that's why I think they're now like the top team. Their defense has been able to rise to the occasion no matter who they're facing, no matter how good the team is. And really their only poor game was the first game of the year against the Packers in Brazil, a very interesting situation in terms of travel and stadium accoutrements and all kinds of stuff. So I think that's the reason why I really trust in the Eagles. And I think the Chiefs have done this to a certain degree during the year, that we've seen some regression and then some progression. And now it seems they're kind of back. And Trent McDuffie had a couple of games where he was really getting tested, and now he's back to the all-pro level that we generally see him at. But I think that's why these are probably the 2 top teams in the league, because they don't have that glaring flaw, whether it be injury based like we see the Lions have, whether it be, change based like we see the Ravens have on defense, or whether the Bills, the defense has been the question mark all year going back to the preseason. And that's why I'm just a little bit more likely to trust in the Eagles, in particular the Chiefs, to a certain degree, more than a team like the Bills or the Lions right now.
Are the Eagles the team that you're the most confident about coming out of the NFC at this point?
Greatly, unfortunately, yes. But that's why it's so fun. Like their flaw is the passing game, which is why I'm saying it's greatly, unfortunately, because if there's anything that you need to trust in, it is the passing game. And their passing game has not been great. It was okay this week, and they were able to get some stuff done. I know A.J. Brown got a little bit banged up. It seems like he's still going to be fine to go forth and play. I do think that a lot of the success on that team is based around A.J. Brown at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And the tackles, obviously. Man, it was an absolute battle. This like nerd out Sam box player, like TJ Watt going against Lane Johnson, just
So
every
fun.
play, all game.
I know.
It was a dog fight. And like, to be fair, TJ Watt got the best of Lane in a way that we very rarely see him take advantage of. A couple times, but it was just an absolute dogfight. But yes, to answer the question, I think the Eagles are the one right now, but they have a pretty big flaw in the passing game.
So speaking of the Eagles, obviously have, an incredible offensive line. As you mentioned, Lane and Mailata, and just like top to bottom, we talked about them a lot last week when we were talking about our Pro Bowl picks. Another team that has an offensive line that we love is the Lions. And one of the stats that popped to me this week going through just the week 15 stats was quarterback pressures, and the quarterback who, according to NFL Pro, which uses next gen stats, had the most pressures of the week was Jared Goff with 25.
Yeah, I think that's probably close. There's a very interesting way that any of these kind of subjective stats, because like the goal of pressuring someone is to cause them discomfort.
Yeah.
And when we're using tracking metrics, we can't track, oh, this dude's heart rate started going up or something like that. Yes, I also got the lines off, but now the light's all weird. It's winter in New York. The light's gonna look weird.
Like
Sorry,
I
guys.
said, you just look like
you
look like we're like a college filmmaker who's really going for like mood,
Hey, I'm close enough to that.
You have like the darkest background, and now your face is lit. It's very
hopefully
LA
we can graduate to the Scorsese phase at some point here, maybe by the draft, But in terms of pressures, it's difficult because I think that statisticians do a pretty good job of logging pressures. And then I think the tracking metrics are measuring something a little different, which is how likely someone is to be sacked. And I think when it's someone like Jared Goff, who is very ready to stand in the pocket and deliver over the middle all the time, he's kind of more likely to be pressured in the sense that he's more likely to be sacked by someone pressing the pocket, but he's also delivering these lovely balls over the middle to Amon-Ra St. Brown or something like that. He's layering them in. It looks beautiful. There was one that he put like just over 2 defenders, hit him in stride. You know, we love to see that. We love good quarterback play, Lindsay. Totally. It's one of my favorite things.
It's my favorite. It is without a doubt my favorite. Although there were a lot of plays this week that were like fun, you know, and felt different. You know, Dan Skipper with the touchdown.
Oh, I love it.
Finally. Finally legally eligible for the play. He is the tallest active player in the NFL at 6'10". And I was so excited that he scored a touchdown. One, because I love big man touchdowns. And then secondly, because I had arbitrarily just Googled earlier that day, for reasons unrelated to him or anything, who is the tallest player in the NFL? It was a conversation that came up with my husband. It had nothing to do with the NFL. We were talking about tall athletes, and Dan Skipper was the tallest. And I was like, he scored a touchdown, and I happen to know this random fact. So there was that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, though, about pressure stats. And that's one of those things that, you know, comes up quite frequently, I guess, with all of these stats, is that there is some subjectivity to it, right? Like what constitutes a pressure, and who I guess gets credit for it as you try and or blame, as the case may be on offense. But the pressure rate was not particularly high. It was 39%, and yet he had the most number of pressures on this tracking metric. Only 3 of them turned into sacks. So that's an incredible pressure to sack ratio, which is the most important stat that we're keeping track of in terms of evaluating quarterback play. So that's a really strong statement about Jared Goff there. How about the 8 sacks for Jaden Daniels? Are we worried about that?
I think this was, I was calling this regression week for our lovely rookie quarterbacks, because it was like the things that we really worry about for our first and second year quarterbacks just popped up for Caleb Williams. They popped up for Bo Nix, even to a certain degree. They popped up for Jaden. They popped up for Bryce Young. Anthony Richardson didn't look good. And that was after a stretch of games where I thought all these guys were pretty well coming along. I think a Saints defensive line, which is not the most athletic of all time and is really built more to stuff the run at any given point in time. That's been their calling card for years, led by Cameron Jordan and guys like David Onyemata back in the day, Carl Granderson as well. It's just not good. And it is alarming, particularly as, you know, they get the win and they're certainly squarely in the playoff race, but that you cannot get sacked 8 times in a game and expect that you can win. And we saw that Spencer Rattler led the Saints back to, you know, a close game. And really they were in a spot where they could have just won it on the 2-point conversion. And I think the primary reason is because you're losing so many expected points on those sacks.
Yeah.
And that's been Bo Nix's calling card all year, is he doesn't look as bad in terms of expected points added as, you know, someone who would be watching film would think, because he just doesn't get sacked. It's like a very simple formula there. And so I'd like to see Jaden clean that up, certainly.
Yeah, I want to get to Bo Nix in just a second, but the Commanders and our level of confidence about them, I think that this is a concerning game, and you can go like, you know, one off, but this is a game where the Saints literally pulled a quarterback mid-game for coach's decision/play. Like, not injured. We're down to like, we're reaching deep into the bag of quarterback play here. And Rattler played, you know, fairly well, right? Like, so, but it's all relative. You want to be a playoff team. I don't think you could beat that Saints team by 1 point.
I agree. Specifically because of the situation that you outlined. I will note that there's good things. I think that when we look at this, Commanders team. They're probably a slightly above average team or just solidly above average. And I think the best part of the game for you, if you're a Commanders fan that just thinks this is a one-off where Jaden didn't play super well, but was able to make some excellent plays, and the running game wasn't really able to get off the ground in the way that they really hope to do it on any given game, is that Marshawn Lattimore chopped the whole side off of the defense. And that was the express reason that you got him, particularly in a Dan Quinn system that loves to blitz and loves to be aggressive. If you can just have people not target Marshawn Lattimore ever, that's going to be great for the things that they can do with the guys like Dorrance Armstrong or Frankie Louvu, who's able to rush the passer from his linebacking position. And really what they can mix in with guys like Jeremy Chin, who's a big safety and can do a lot of things too. So I think that's the glimmer of hope there, that their defense, particularly at those cornerback positions, can be shored up a little bit with the ascendance of Mikey Samerstill and now Marshawn Lattimore having a little coming out party in New Orleans where he was for so many years.
Okay, two Bo Nix, since you brought him up. This Denver defense has been incredible.
Yeah.
They are in the playoffs right now in the 6th spot in the AFC. We might have 3 teams from the AFC West in the playoffs. We've got Kansas City in right now as the 1 seed. That may or may not. They effectively have a 1-game lead on the Bills right now, since the Bills have the tiebreaker, but it's technically 2 games at the moment. And then we've got Denver in the 6th hole. We've got the Chargers in the 7 hole. The 3 teams that are out feel out to me, even though they're not actually technically out. And that's the Colts, the Dolphins, and the Bengals. Those are the 3 teams left in the AFC that haven't been eliminated. But they're 2 games back of the Chargers for the last spot. So I'm not necessarily anticipating any changes here. And the Denver, certainly not to Denver at 9-5. So what are we thinking about Denver here? Because the defense, again, very good. I mean, we talk about defenses. We're talking about concerns about other defenses. Well, Denver's defense is number 1 across the board since week 10. I mean, the best. But are we worried enough about the offense? Do we think that the offense is this a team that can win a game in the playoffs?
The whole calling card of them, particularly in their defense, is that they've kind of just taken advantage when they face guys that they think they can get after. And we saw that certainly last week against Indianapolis. They thought they could just get after Anthony Richardson and confuse him a whole bunch. And that's basically what happened. And I mean, he had a pretty rough game, 17 for 38, 172 yards, 2 sacks, which we rarely see him take sacks like that. It just wasn't super beautiful. They were able to do what they wanted to do, and they were able to make big plays as they did on the kind of throwback with Nick Bonito. The problem in the AFC is there's not a lot of quarterbacks that you can take advantage of. I think when depending on how the matchups break, when Justin Herbert is the guy that you're going to try to pick on, like, that's not a great spot to be in. When you're trying to pick on Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, it's a way, way, way worse spot to be in, particularly given how those 2 guys, Jackson and Allen, are playing right now. And if you look back in their schedule, they forced Tampa Bay and Baker early on in the season to make some errors. They've taken advantage of New Orleans with a tough quarterback situation. That was back when they were, again, as they are now, trying to figure out the backup situation. Carolina, they took bad advantage of. Atlanta, they smoked. And so I think given the way they play, the rate of man that they play and the rate that they like to blitz, it's really leaning back on how confusing can we make this for people. And I think a matchup with the Steelers probably is ideal for them given their kind of run heavy attack. But I'm probably a little bit more confident than I am in them in the Chargers right now, because I think they have an elite defense, and I don't know what the Chargers do that's elite, but I think they're good in a couple things.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my general thought on the Broncos.
Well, and to that point, I think we're going to get some clarity this week because we've got the Broncos at the Chargers. So we'll kind of see how they match up against one another to get a better feel for it. But to your point about the Chargers, I mean, the defense used to be their calling card. They were a very strong run game. They were a very strong defense. They were number 1 in EPA per play against weeks 1 through 9. They're 25th since then. 25th. I mean, we know about the run game, so they lose J.K. Dobbins to injury, and Gus, they haven't really, the run game hasn't gone. I mean, they haven't run the offense through the ground since then. Gus Edwards hasn't really been, anything special. So we can explain the run game there. The defense is interesting because that's a massive drop off for them. I'm worried about the Chargers at this point in the playoffs. I don't know that I feel strongly about either of these teams getting a win in the playoffs. Honestly, they feel like they could, but it wouldn't be because they were the better team. Like, it wouldn't feel predictive to me.
Right.
I'm not feeling confident about the Chargers because they're no longer strong in the areas that they were strong before. We all know that the Chargers need a pass catcher next year. And I think everybody has circled on their wish list for them in the draft or free agency to go get a wide receiver. But now you also need a tailback. Like, you need somebody to run the rock for the rest of the year. And I don't know where you're going to get that.
It's going into the year, the question for them was always talent. And like, very similar to the Buffalo Bills, like the defensive talent was questionable for the Buffalo Bills, and the offensive talent outside of Justin Herbert and the tackles was questionable for the Chargers. And I think that's cropping up. I think we've seen Ladd McConkey play pretty well and come along pretty well, but he can only do so much, particularly when you're getting 0 from the run game and you're based around the run game. The defense has been a little bit more interesting because I do think they have talent on that defense. We've seen Tarheeb still kind of come along and be an impact player for them. Derwin James obviously still there. Khalil Mack, Bosa when he's available. And also their linebackers have played decently well. Troy Dye has come in and been a pretty effective run defender in relief of their other guys who have gotten injured. Christian Fulton, I think, in recent weeks has by my eye, not played super great. And I think that people have started to ID the sources of weakness that they have and really attack. And I think the number of weaknesses that they have, we knew this going into the season. It was why they were picking pretty highly last year is they're just not the most talented team. And I think when you compare that even to the Broncos, who have a lot of talented players on defense, they have Pat Surtain and Benito, as we talked about, and just a bunch of guys that are quite talented. That's why I kind of lean at this point in the Broncos kind of more elite talent direction than the Chargers, who always could lean back on Justin Herbert, though. And if Justin Herbert starts playing as he was playing kind of in that midseason role again, and they kind of open it up a little bit, who knows what could happen there.
How he played in the first half against the Bengals.
Very true. Very true.
That half, let's duplicate that for 2 halves, however. Looking at the AFC, there's a lot of you've got Kansas City, which is Kansas City, right? Like, it's
right.
Actually, let's dig into Kansas City for 2 seconds, because I do think that there's a component of the way that they play that doesn't get enough credit, right? Like, everybody wants to, call everything that happens with regards to them lucky. And there's certainly a component of luck, but they also feel like just the definition of creating your own luck in terms of staying ahead of the sticks, and like success rate and stuff like that. Like the unsexy stats, they kind of dominate in those departments. And so they're not explosive and they're not flashy, and the ADOT's really low, and like things that just feel like unimpressive, they do very well. But it almost feels strategic, I suppose. What is your take on them and how they've done what they've done this season?
I 100% agree with you. And I think when you look at the high success rate, which is higher than their EPA per play, that is one thing. I was really shocked by this. So again, going back to that pass rate, rush rate over expected. In this case, we're going to be talking about pass rate over expected. Number 1, the Cincinnati Bengals, no shock there. Number 2, the Kansas City Chiefs. So they're doing what it takes to get ahead of the sticks, and they're playing into the analytics of EPA per pass, typically being a little higher than EPA per rush, but you would never think of it. And they're a very good early downs team. They get in those 3rd and shorts. They play behind their guards and center, Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith and Joe Tooney. they did in the early season. And here's kind of, to a certain degree, why I think this is a little bit predictive, is because number 3 is the Minnesota Vikings, which is also a little bit shocking to me, because the Minnesota Vikings seem like a very, spam play action, let's get the ball on the ground first and then air it out deep team. But they've been really good this year as well, and in a similar fashion as the Kansas City Chiefs on offense, just in the fact that, they've been able to take advantage of Sam Darnold playing a little bit better. And so I think that strategy of, let's lean into the pass game where we know we're going to be good. We know that people are going to give us too high and cover 4 sets. And then we're going to get it in the 3rd and short or convert on 1st or 2nd down. And if it's 3rd and short, we're going to get it every time because we have a better interior offensive line than you, is like certainly a defined choice by them. Now, given they like to smoke everyone, don't get me wrong, but I think at the pace that they've continued to do this consistently, I'm kind of a believer at this point.
Does it feel predictive in terms of moving into the playoffs? This style, can they do that against the best teams in the NFL?
The best part for them is that some of these defenses are shaky, man. Like the Bills have a shaky defense. I think they can take advantage of them. The Ravens do have a good rushing defense, but I think there's places to take advantage of them as well. Mm-hmm. I think the Steelers have a good defense, but we saw a similar playbook work for the Eagles last week. Like I don't think they're unbeatable. Then we already talked about the Chargers and the Broncos. Like I think there's other ways to win against them. And the AFC is so interesting because you have all these awesome quarterbacks, but you have all these immensely flawed teams. And I think the Chiefs are just like, on average, the least flawed when it comes down to it.
Looking at the playoff picture in the other conference, I have here's what I want to ask you. So we've got Detroit, Philly, Tampa Bay, the Rams, Minnesota, Green Bay, Washington that are in right now. And then there are 6 teams that are outside right now, but not yet eliminated. Only 3 teams eliminated in the NFC right now. So everyone not named Chicago, Carolina, and the Giants are still, alive. What, in terms of the 6 teams on the outside, are there any that you see getting in? Are there any that you think are the teams that could or should make a run to supplant one of the teams that are currently in a spot?
Just because we never know what can happen in the NFC South, and I think there's a move that they could take to get upside. And like, I'm really clenching my eyes and grinding my teeth here, but like the Falcons could make a move. I think they have the talent to make a move on offense. And the Buccaneers have been high variance all year. They've been looking great. They're coming off of, not the best schedule of all time. Maybe there's something that goes downhill in there. If the Falcons move to Michael Penix, I just think there's more upside and they can potentially go on a run.
Can you imagine? I mean, but what's interesting about that is that when you said it, I was like, Kirk is playing awfully. Right. Like you look at any kind of quarterback rankings, like advanced stats, all this stuff, like he's like one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL in these last few weeks. And I mean, you don't even need to look at advanced stats. Like we see that, right? Yeah. It's not clicking. But to even think about the fact that putting in a rookie who has never played a single game might be, and I understand what you're saying. You're just saying like there's an unknown component to it. What if he's great? What if? Like, so there's variance attached to that.
What if he just gets the ball to Drake London and Darnell Mooney 4 more times a game is really the question there.
Like any times a game to Mooney after 0 this past week. That's a fantasy reaction. Anyway, Atlanta, I mean, if they don't make that move and if the variance doesn't swing wildly in favor of Penix, I just think that Tampa Bay is a better team.
Oh, I certainly agree.
Plus 77, Atlanta's minus 49. Like that would be the travesty of the playoffs if that flipped somehow and Tampa Bay was on the outside looking in and Atlanta somehow got in because they've just been so far worse this year. The NFC West is obviously the division that feels the most like, however the chips fall. Seattle and Los Angeles are currently tied at 8-6, but the Rams are in tiebreaker. So the Rams are in right now. I feel like they look like a better team. And certainly if Geno is sidelined, though. It's not necessarily looking like it's going in that direction, but that was an interesting experiment. Let's call it that. With Gino leaving that game and Sam Howell going in, knowing that in the offseason, we're going to have a conversation about Gino and an extension and what he's worth and what do you do? And are we wasting time by like dragging this out? Should we go in a different direction? I mean, I think at the very least what we saw, and it's the most extreme this guy to that guy in this particular department, is what Gino has done this year to kind of cover up some flaws on the offensive line.
Yep.
You know, like I think he's glossed over some issues that exist there. And then you put Sam Howell behind them and he gets sacked 2 times in 5 plays at one point. And you know, those deficiencies are all like he's the poster child for the guy who's going to shine the spotlight on any problems that have to do with pressure coming from the offensive line. But I think Seattle is an interesting team that I think I feel more confident about the Los Angeles Rams at this point than Seattle. Seattle just feels like it's what do you think is the strength of Seattle that would make you feel like if they did get in could potentially cause some damage?
I think the strength of the team is Leonard Williams and Mike McDonald building a whole defense around Leonard Williams. And there's just games in which that can kind of flunk out, like when it did against the Packers. I will note, though, there was a moment in that Packers game where the crowd got into it, the defense got to stop, and it was just like, wait, is this team going to come back? Then, unfortunately, Gino went down. Yeah. But I think if you're betting on the Seahawks, it's a bet that Mike McDonald is going to figure this defense out long term and that they have enough guys that are talented. I'd really consider Leonard Williams as the only elite player. I think Ernest Jones has been good. I think Julian Love has been pretty good. But again, like talking about like whether they're average or not average, above average, the Rams are just have elite players at very important positions. Jared Verse has been an elite player. Puka Nacua is an elite player. Matthew Stafford can be at times an elite player. And when you have guys at important positions like edge and defensive tackle, Kobe Turner has been excellent.
Oh my God, so good.
In recent games, and wide receiver, you're just going to be hard to beat if those guys are on.
What do you make of DK this year? Back to Seattle.
It's so funny because now we're in this chicken or the egg cycle that I never thought we were going to be in. You mentioned Gino and the extension. The offense has asked, and we saw this when Sam Howell came in, the offense has asked so much of Gino this year, and he's been able to make so many guys look good. But it looks like the future at that position is certainly Jackson Smith and Jigba, right?
Yeah.
And is there we've
now
seen
looks like it's Jackson Smith and Jigba.
Yeah, so we've seen these teams in the past. You know, the Chiefs have done this before. It looks like the Bengals are going to try to do this again. Try to address this redundancy at the wide receiver position by, you know, seeking out draft picks and all this other stuff. I don't really know. Like I can't get a read on it, particularly, I guess, because of Gino's past of being like shaky at times. And you have to ask yourself a question of how good do you think Gino really is, and how much does that affect DK to a certain degree? And I just don't have a great answer right now. I just don't know. It's such a difficult question.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like it's hard to evaluate DK when you're also evaluating your quarterback.
Right.
Like when you have a question mark at that spot, it's really hard to know what the answers are at all the other spots. They're going to be a fascinating. I mean, Gino, we've talked a lot about, you know, Purdy and Sam Darnold and what you do with their contracts this offseason and like how you pay them. And Gino's another guy, you know, where I feel like the toughest spot, and I've said this over and over again, I feel like the toughest spot for a team to be in is to have a quarterback who's good enough, because then it feels like it could be way worse, you know? And so do we risk moving off of this because it can be way worse? But then you also never move off of it, or you're wary to do so because,
right.
and so you never take that swing at the guy who is the guy, who's him,
It's funny though, because we talked about in the past couple of years how there has been no quote quarterback middle class. And now it feels like it's kind of coming back. It feels like Sam Darnold is strongly in there. It feels like Geno is strongly in there. It feels like Baker Mayfield is strongly in there. Brock Purdy is going to be a huge argument apparently, but like I think in terms of the status of them, he can go in the Tua and the Jared Goff class as well, contract notwithstanding. And so I wonder if there's a future where, the $30 to $50 million, $30 to $40 million quarterback just does exist and it starts proliferating. Because, like, let's be real here. Like, Geno has won games for them, but I don't know if Geno can win any given game for them. And it's the same talk of Sam Darnold and it's the same talk of Baker Mayfield. Like, Baker Mayfield alone has won games for Tampa Bay this year. I just know that he's also probably going to lose games for Tampa Bay this year. And I think that teams are kind of okay with that to a certain degree at this point.
Okay, you bring up an interesting point here about about classes at quarterback. Let's take the financial aspect out, which you can't really. Who's in the upper class? Like, who fits into that category at this point in time for you? Where's our line? It's obviously Josh, Lamar, Burrow, and Patrick, right? Like, we feel comfortable putting those 4 guys in the upper class.
As much as I've gone around the country on radio shows saying Burrow is underrated, I may be underrating him. I was going to say just the 3 sans Burrow and put Burrow in second.
Well, but I think that's fair though, because
definitely fair to put Burrow there as well.
But I think it's fair about Burrow, and this is a conversation that's come up when I've talked to people about Sam Darnold lately and some other people. We're talking about what these quarterbacks look like in good environments now, because we've seen them in bad environments. Have we seen we've seen Joe with Chase and T, and like, I think we've seen enough to think that he is somebody who could overcome a bad environment, but he hasn't been in that. And so I don't totally know. So I suppose that's fair, maybe, to like downgrade him to a degree. Hope people are going to be big mad about that.
Now I'm reversing course. I don't know. He's looked excellently this year. I think Herbert and Burrow are probably like question mark. I think Herbert has looked good at times this year. And I think Burrow also has like an availability issue where he's like practically missed the better parts of 2 seasons in his career as well, which is a little different. But I think it's fair to say like who are the top quarterbacks that you would trade basically anyone on your team or any amount of capital to get? It's certainly Herbert, Burrow, Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen.
I would very, very much like to see Herbert in a situation where I don't have built-in excuses.
Right.
I would very much like to see that. If for no other reason than because I know that people watch, and again, going back to that Bengals game, you've got like the first half's incredible, and then the second half is not. And it just feels like, please, from start to finish, just put it together, But then obviously this year he doesn't have pass catchers. In the past, he has had pass catchers, but there have been other issues at play. Like so that I can stop feeling like an apologist, because I feel the same about Herbert. I think that he does have those skills that are just, there are things that he does that are so special, but then there are some inconsistencies that kind of make me feel like I don't feel as comfortable banging tables for him right this second as I did 2 years ago. And I think it's just because of the consistent inconsistency.
How much more do you have to see from Jordan Love to get in this class?
That's a good question. Because the weird thing is that the beginning of the year this year, because there's certainly a big group of people who are like, oh, wow, we sure paid him pretty quick, in the offseason. Are we sure he's good? Are we sure that he's worth it? It's a small sample size. First half of the season last year, not particularly great. Second half of the season, very, very good. Run game was incredible also. The whole thing was clicking. and then he gets paid and then comes out. And the first half of this season, it looks like maybe it's a mistake, but he's banged up. So now he's healthy and he looks good, but he's not taking over games. They're not putting the ball in his hands. So I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of reason to be like, I don't know what I'm seeing with Jordan Love in terms of whether or not he belongs in this class. Like, I'm seeing enough to be like, that's great that he's their quarterback and they're, we're considering them for a playoff run, and we're certainly not talking about him like a liability. That's a win for our franchise. But if we're talking about putting him in a tier with these types of guys, I think I need to see him be the reason.
That's a good point. I think he's kind of in a class of if quarterbacks are a bell curve, which they probably are not, but there's like the upswing and there's the downswing. And I think at this point, like, would it be a toss up for you between Matt Stafford for the next 2 years or Jordan Love for the next 2 years? Because Matt Stafford, we've seen this year, any given game, be really rough.
Yeah. But also brilliant.
Exactly.
Like you're right. He's a wild example because he's clearly like your favorite quarterback's favorite quarterback.
Right.
And you see the reasons why. But then there are games where you're like, what is he doing?
Exactly.
Is he not feeling well today?
And the turnover worthy plays have been there, very similar to Love. And Love, it feels like he hasn't figured it exactly out yet, but it's clear that he's coming along. And then it's kind of the opposite.
Who's our OC in this scenario too? Because it all kind of like, I think I feel more comfortable with Stafford, assuming he's in a good environment. Like if I put Jordan Love on the Rams, I think I would go with Stafford in a 2-year sample size. Anything longer than that, obviously you're talking about age. But in the short term, I think I feel more comfortable with Stafford. But you also named the one guy who is like much lower down the list in terms of when fans talk about quarterbacks. Stafford's not even remotely knocking on the door of the elite conversation. He's just like in that middle tier. But I think he's not in that middle tier.
Yeah, I think he's in you can get darn close to a championship with this guy. But there's like 2 tiers of that guy too. It's like Stafford and Love are the guys who probably have the arm talent to be able to win playoff games by themselves. And then, I'm not going to put Tua in this class exactly this year, but like Tua ran an elite offense last year. And then Jared Goff's kind of the guy this year where it's like they actually are just not going to make a mistake, but we've seen them make so many mistakes. And you can probably make it to a title game with those guys as well if everything is correct, which everything has been right for the Lions this year, and everything was in the correct place until some injuries happened last year for Miami.
Well, you've got me thinking, Sam. And I love that. That's my favorite thing about these types of conversations is when I leave thinking about things that are different than what I was thinking about coming in. Sam Bruchhaus, you can find his work on the Sumer Daily Pod, which you can find daily on whatever podcast platform you are on. Also, his written work is at SumerSports.com. I hope you'll go check that out. We've also talked a lot about some advanced stats, and you can find access to a lot of these advanced stats in the various rankings at SumerSports.com. There are a lot of pay subscription sites where you can go find these, but it's all free at SumerSports. So go check out the website for that information, and we will be back next week with another edition of the Sumer Sports Show. Thanks for being with us.